Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our ethics and science class. Let me share my screen, get into the PowerPoint, and we will get going. So, you might notice there's no joke here at the top. That's because our subject matter is pretty serious. What we're talking about is the development of norms for research on human subjects, which involves a lot of history and a lot of kind of disturbing history. We have gotten to these norms in a lot of ways as a response to some atrocious things that were done in the history of human science, and it just didn't feel appropriate to start with a joke. So let's get into it and let's get through this together. I believe that we are capable of covering these things together because we have not shied away from them in this class so far. In fact, our first week dealt with a lot of this stuff already, and now we're going to be dealing with it again with hopefully some better knowledge of ethics so that we can even further see how this has led to actual practices of ethics so that we don't repeat ourselves. Starting with ancient versus modern understandings of science. Um, Somewhere along the way in human history, and we would point to the period of modernism with Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes, the understanding of what science is underwent a fundamental change. The ancients, and we would point to people like Aristotle for this, saw themselves as scientists where today we might see them as philosophers. Um, and their understanding of science was more philosophical, more contemplative. That term's in quotes because contemplation means something different in other contexts. But they were primarily focused on the observation of the world, the way that we might achieve something through reason alone, whereas the moderns were more interested in the mastery of nature. They were primarily focused on experimentation. They used language of things like probing nature, giving it an autopsy, stuff like that. Definitely more hands-on, and in some ways, you might say more violent with it. There was less of a respect there, which would eventually lead to a lack of respect for human research subjects, but not right away, and we'll talk about that. So first, early research on human subjects. Some of the first subjects of human research were scientists experimenting on themselves because they didn't want to do these kinds of dangerous things to anybody else. And there's some examples on page 133 of our textbook. There was a researcher who wanted to prove that yellow fever came from mosquitoes, and he did so by contracting yellow fever from a mosquito, and he died. Um, he did, however, prove that yellow fever came from mosquitoes, so that is scientific research, and that is, I guess, a win in his column. And this does actually still happen to an extent. I'll link an article on Canvas. I have it right here. Yeah, this is helpful to pull up. So this is an article from Scientific American about two scientists. The main guy is a guy named Barry Marshall, who gave himself ulcers as a way of proving a point, and he eventually won a Nobel Prize for his research. So sometimes conducting these experiments on yourself could be considered quite ethical. It's a fascinating read. I, am blown away by the tenacity of somebody who would potentially harm themselves in the name of scientific research and then in the name of helping others. Um, but for most of human history, research on other humans was taboo. And so was a lot of the experimental stuff that might be done to plants and animals. It's not until the moderns that that changes. And even afterwards, with humans, someone like Louis Pasteur, who developed the rabies vaccine, was really worried about testing it on a human child, even though if he had been successful, that kid would have been cured of rabies. But he agonized over that decision, even though he had the full consent of the family. But eventually, some people began conducting experiments on slaves, on the poor, and other marginalized groups because the people conducting these experiments did not acknowledge the full humanity of their research subjects. This is, of course, a huge problem. And we should say that absolutely every piece of research done in this way was without ethics, was morally wrong, and that those scientists should be reprimanded in history and if they are still alive directly. So the development of rules for human subjects came from a couple of things. They came from responses to unethical research being done on humans. We have two examples here, really three. We have the Nuremberg Code, which came from the doctors' trials. This was the code that was developed to assess whether or not Nazi doctors had unethically experimented on Jews living in concentration camps. Living in is not the right word. Jews who had been forced into concentration camps. These doctors, many of whom went to prison for good reason because they were acting unethically. I've shown you this before, but I have the Nuremberg Code right here. So this is from the 40s. There's 10 points here. We have the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. You cannot experiment on anybody without giving voluntary consent. Then we have the experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unproducible by other methods or means of study, and not random or unnecessary in nature, because a lot of the experiments that led to the drafting of this were random and unnecessary. And it goes on. And this is a very important document. In some ways, you could say that this would still hold up today and might actually hold us to better standards than we currently have. Then there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which our textbook argues flows out of the Nuremberg Code, but expands it beyond the bounds of science to government. And it's a pretty quick read. I have it right here from the UN. Article 1, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. It's pretty good stuff. Article 4, no one should be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all forms. These are aspirational documents that we should live up to and do not often live up to in ways that we could. But they are excellent for governing science because if you have something like human rights in mind, well, you're not going to violate the rights of your participant. I've stopped sharing. Hold, please. Okay, back to this. So then we have the Declarations of Helsinki, and this gets updated several times. And the controversy here comes that the revisions from the year 2000 were thought to be too strict by the US and the European Commission. And the reason why was that the Helsinki Declaration demanded that in cases where it was appropriate, like if you're trying to develop a drug that could treat something better than a previous drug, the control group would be given the previous drug. The reason why the US and the European Commission didn't like that so much was that it made things like drug trials more expensive. And economics really was the reason behind that. There was no altruistic, human rights reason for that, for their rejection of the 2000 revisions. It was just because they didn't want to have to spend so much money. And even though that practice was already being done in Europe and the United States, where the old drug would be used for the control group, their reasoning for objecting to it was that they couldn't continue the practice of a placebo group when they could in places that we would call the developing world. Again, in the previous lecture, I said we should probably call it the 2/3 world. That's neither here nor there. A question of, okay, how much do we really need these rules of ethics? Aren't we good enough? Aren't we smart enough? Could it happen here? And so here's a quote from our textbook. And so there was until the late 1960s a kind of self-satisfaction or complacency in the US biomedical research establishment regarding ethics. It was assumed that Americans just could not behave like Germans. The problem, of course, is that we know from history Americans did behave like Germans. It was just done with more secrecy. And we can remember here that many of the American scientists working in the government at that time were, in fact, previously German scientists. They had been brought over here on Operation Paperclip. And many of the unethical experiments continued here in the US. The Tuskegee experiments, which were not a part of that project, are also another, fly in the eye of that idea that in fact something quite unethical happened here, and it happened over the course of more than 30 years, where research subjects, all of whom were African American, were not told that they had syphilis while they were being studied. They were prohibited from seeking treatment for their disease in other places, and they were not treated, even though they could be treated after a cure for syphilis was found. All of this came to light in 1974. It's the reason for the Belmont document that we looked at in the previous lecture. It is one of the worst things to take place on American soil, and it went relatively unpunished, and that is a terrible thing. We will talk about this more in next week's lectures because one of our readings deals exclusively in Tuskegee. So more on this to come, more thoughts, more ways in which a better sense of ethics could have prevented something like this, more ways in which we can make sure it doesn't happen again, because as we've talked about, the prevention of misconduct is more important than the detection of misconduct. Yeah, so this leads to some present questions of research on human subjects, which is marginal communities are still being experimented on worldwide, even with some level of consent at play, and in some places without a level of consent. I believe I shared information with you previously about Nestle, where they were conducting not really scientific experiments, but market research using baby formula in certain communities in Africa. And their mismanagement of all that led to the death of infants. You know, that is people being experimented on. That is research on human subjects, even if it is more about marketing. And then, the developing world, again, quotes, hosts more drug trials than the developed world. And is this ethical or just? It's typically done in those places because you can find more willing participants. But that doesn't seem like a great justification for experimenting on marginal communities. And then just how informed can you help a participant be? If somebody has never received an education in their life, how capable is that person of understanding the risks that you are putting them under, especially when they might really need the paycheck? Is their consent informed when they've got to feed their family? That leads to some pretty big ethical dilemmas. A final one, and this leads into, first, next week. I've got 2 readings for you, one from Alan Brandt, The Case of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Read that. We'll talk more about Tuskegee in next week's videos. Then we have Research Ethics and Indigenous Communities. So again, continuing our themes for next week. I'll have 2 lectures for you, lectures 14 and 15, and a discussion post. There is also this week a quiz due. If you haven't taken quiz 4 yet, make sure you do that. So this week's discussion post, and this is really the final question of ethics in research on human subjects for the week, is it ethical to infect healthy people with a potentially deadly disease as a part of a vaccine research trial? Who, globally, economically, however you want to put it, should be chosen for these infections? What potential ethical problems do you see with the practice of infecting healthy people with disease in vaccine research? I think, around all this, we might, because we're thinking about disease and vaccines, we'd probably think about COVID-19. That does not have to be your primary focus for this. You can if you want it to be, but you can also spread that question a little bit farther. And it really is an interesting thing to think about, right? Because if you were healthy enough that whatever disease it is wouldn't have too many adverse effects, yeah, sure, infect me, whatever, I give my full consent. But what about in cases where that disease is always going to be more deadly? Well, then it becomes a little less clear. How much do you trust that vaccine before you infect someone? I don't know. I don't have answers to these questions. Anyway, thank you for watching these lectures. Thank you for following along. Like I said in the last video, midterms happened pretty recently, and so if you have any questions about that, please email me. Get in touch with me, come to office hours, whatever you need for that. And I will see you guys next week with some more lectures, and I will see you in our discussion boards. Have a nice day, everybody, and stay safe. I will see you soon.